So in the industrial Midwest, we've had a busy year and lots of attacks, and voter suppression is a part of it. But as I think people know, we don't just get attacked, we fight back, and sometimes we win. And so that's what we're doing there. So many stories, so little time. You heard about the nuns in Indiana. Indiana has a voter ID thing. There's stuff in the works in potentially in Michigan, Illinois, but I'm going to talk about Ohio and Wisconsin here very briefly. You know, it's not just about ID. And in Ohio, we beat back the attempt to create ID, but the Republican majority, the anti-worker majority that passed the fight against collective bargaining, also passed a sweeping voter suppression bill that shortens the early voting period from 5 weeks to 3 weeks, bans in-person early voting on Sundays. What's that about? That's about all the churches that were organizing to bring their people to vote after church on buses and whatever. That's banned under this law. And prohibits Board of Elections from sending people out absentee ballot applications to allow them to vote by mail. So this is really targeted against folks in urban areas, poor people, people of color, senior citizens. In fact, in the capital city of Ohio, Columbus, in 2008, where we had a great turnout, 4 in 10 voters voted by methods that would be banned under this law. 40% of the people that cast ballots in Columbus, Ohio in 2008, the method they used to cast a ballot would be declared illegal under this law. Now, fortunately, in Ohio, we have something called the citizens' veto. You all may have heard about it with the attack on collective bargaining that we were able to do. You'll hear more about that tomorrow. But we were able to get petitions signed, and CWA helped lead the way on this. You know, some folks in the labor movement have a hard time doing more than one thing at once. CWA people are good at doing lots of things at once. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We could fight voter suppression and fight battles of workers' rights and lots of other things at the same time. We got hundreds of thousands of signatures. And so what that did is it stayed that law. It is not going to take effect until the citizens get to vote on it. So the battleground 2012 election for president, for senator, for the Supreme Court in Ohio will not have these voter suppression laws in effect. People have the right to vote by mail. People will have 5 weeks. People will be able to register and vote in that 1 week, 5 weeks ahead of time. And then they will go to the polls in 2012, and we will veto that anti-democracy law, just like we vetoed that anti-collective bargaining law with overwhelming support in 2012. In Wisconsin, you know, Scott Walker, thank you, and the anti-worker, anti-democracy majority passed a law that does require ID to show a driver's license or state-issue ID of some kind. Now, you know, what a lot of people said, this is nothing but a poll tax. A poll tax was the device, as people may know, that was used in the Jim Crow South to prevent African Americans from voting because they didn't have the money to pay this poll tax. Well, they thought they'd try to get around that to make sure it's not illegal, which is, you know, what they're fighting in Texas. So they said, if you tell the Department of Motor Vehicles that you're getting the ID for the purpose of voting, they'll waive the $28 fee. Now, they may or may not do that. We'll leave that part aside for a minute. But the problem is, to get a free ID, you need to provide them with a birth certificate or passport. Birth certificates cost $20. They're not free, and there's no provision. And in fact, there's been a lawsuit filed by the ACLU in Wisconsin to try to overturn this law. And one of the things in the lawsuit, they lay out the case of Ruth L. Frank, who has voted every single election since 1948. She's 84 years old. She does not have a birth certificate. So she called the county registrar of deeds to get a birth certificate, and they couldn't find her. Finally, the state's Office of Vital Records found a birth certificate, but both her parents' names were misspelled. So the document was invalid, and she'd have to get it amended, which would cost $200. Ms. Frank said, I decided I didn't want to spend the $200 for the right to vote because I always thought the right to vote was free, and I don't think it's fair. We also heard from Wisconsin the story of Florence Hessling. 96 years old, Florence Hessling is disabled and rarely leaves her home, and is always voted by absentee ballot. She has a driver's license that expired a few years ago, and so she wrote to the state asking for the requirements about a new photo ID. She received a response that told her she had to pay the $28 fee, but first had to come up with her birth certificate. So she wrote to Iowa, where she was born. Maybe Senator Harkin can help her, because the state had no official record of her birth, 96 years old. She has no official record of her birth. She's been voting her whole life. She says, I think that's unfair that I can't vote. I feel like I was thrown out. In addition, the Wisconsin law cuts the early voting period in a similar way to Ohio that I described before. This attack on democratic rights is about nothing other than swaying elections in battleground states. In states like Ohio and Wisconsin, presidential elections are swung by 1 or 2 votes per precinct across the state. If they can keep 1 or 2 people per precinct from exercising their right to vote, they can change the outcome of elections in these battleground states. That is what this is about. This voter fraud thing, in addition to it being ridiculous, does not explain why they're cutting back people's opportunities to vote early. Right? In 2004 in Ohio, we had people standing out in the rain in lines for as much as 2 hours in urban areas because they cut the number of polling places and because of other problems. That may have, some people had to get back to work. Some people couldn't stay in lines for 2 and 3 hours. That election was close enough in Ohio in 2004, as you may remember. It could have changed who the president of the United States was if people had had the right to vote. That's how important this is. But the only way we're going to win this fight is to make sure that we really build the connections between workers' rights and democratic rights. You've been hearing this in a bunch of different forms the whole time we've been here. We need to build a majority movement to fight for democracy, to fight for workers' rights, to fight for good jobs and strong communities. These fights are united. The fact remains is this. In 2010, across the Midwest, before any of these voter suppression bills were passed, we got our butts kicked because millions of working class people did not show up to vote. We can't blame voter suppression for that. We have to blame our inability to build the kind of majority movement that made people feel engaged about voting, that made people feel like their vote would make a difference, that made people feel like if we won, we'd keep the movement going to hold these politicians accountable, to do the things they said, to create good jobs and strong communities. That's what we're doing in the Midwest. That's what we need to do everywhere. Keep fighting. Stand up, fight back. Thanks.